In this video I'd like to talk about a British film from the 1930s. You couldn't really call it an obscure film because in some ways it's quite well known, but on the other hand it's not exactly a household word nowadays, and perhaps it should be, because it's the very first, as far as I know, the very first British science fiction film called Things to Come, which was made in 1936. So it fits into my category not as an obscure film, but it's certainly a British film and from the 1930s. So anyway, it's a film that I like very much, and I think it should be better known. It's known amongst film buffs, but it's not probably known very much nowadays with the wider public. But partly because I think it should be better known, partly because not only it's a British film, but I mean it's considered by many people to be the first great science fiction film. And it was made in 1936, which in Britain was fairly early in the history of talkie cinema. And that shows in some ways in the style of acting and so on. But on the other hand, it's amazingly advanced, particularly in its visual effects and the special effects, which are quite stunning in places. So it was made in 1936, and it was directed by a man called William Cameron Menzies, who I'm not sure that he made any other films, but he's certainly not a famous filmmaker. But it was produced by Alexander Korda, who certainly was a very famous producer and impresario of films. And it's the kind of big, extravagant production that Korda was very interested in producing. He basically tried to create a British film, a movie industry that will be as good as and as big as potentially as Hollywood, and to some extent he succeeded with London films and so on. And so it was produced in 1936. It stars some major actors of that time. Raymond Massey, well-known Canadian actor who's in a lot of British films of that period. Also Ralph Richardson, who later became a very famous Shakespearean actor. A number of others. Let's see, Cedric Hardwicke, another well-known actor. Margarita Scott and Anne Todd. They're some of the actors. And the piece itself was made with the collaboration of H.G. Wells. I forgot to mention, it is based on a famous book called The Shape of Things to Come by the extremely famous British science fiction writer H.G. Wells. And the film starts with H.G. Wells' Things to Come, and he wrote the script, the screenplay, which was a reworking of this book that he wrote in 1933, which I've read. It's a very interesting book. It's basically a kind of history of the future, and it imagines what was going to happen in the future. In some parts of it he gets pretty right, and he certainly gets it right that there will be another major war within the next 10 years. In fact, he only gets it wrong by about a year. In the film and the book, the war starts in 1940 rather than 1939. But there are some differences. But it's typical of H.G. Wells in that it starts with envisaging the disasters that were likely to happen because of technology being used for things like warfare, things like mass bombing, for example. At that time, in the early 30s, people, all the way through the 30s, people imagined that if there was mass bombing, as there was, of course, in the Second World War, it will be absolutely catastrophic. I mean, just a couple of massive raids and cities would just be completely wiped out and cease to function. In fact, it turned out this was not the case. There were massive bombing raids, and they did cause terrible death and devastation. But the interesting thing was that people kept going through them, as in the Blitz in London. It didn't actually affect civilian morale in the way it was expected. Also, the other thing they expected was that they would that poison gas would be used, which thankfully it wasn't in the Second World War. Anyway, so the idea of the story is it starts with in a city called Everytown, and it's at Christmas. Now, Everytown, you can see from the set that it's actually London. I mean, you can see St Paul's Cathedral in the distance, but it's called Everytown. It's Christmas, and everybody's bustling around enjoying themselves. You know, it's all very festive. It's Christmas Eve, and last-minute purchases and stuff. But all the time, it's a brilliant opening scene. All the time, amidst all the merriment, you see news placards and newspaper sellers and people mentioning war, danger of war, hostilities breaking out, threat of invasion. So it keeps cutting between the two, and it creates this sort of very bustling, but actually more and more manic and alarming atmosphere, and you feel that something terrible is going to happen, and indeed something terrible does happen, because there is a massive air raid, and that's the opening of the film. And what happens is the war that starts in 1940 goes on until the 1960s, so Wells had a far more apocalyptic idea of what was going to happen than actually did happen, and by the end of it, essentially civilization, certainly in the Western world, is just destroyed, and people revert to barbarism, and there's either anarchy or there's rule by sort of robber baron type people who take over. And it features, by about 1970, London, or what's left of it, every town, the ruins of London are controlled, and that area is controlled by a character called the Chief, who's played splendidly by Ralph Richardson. He really gets into the part. He rides around on a horse, and he's sort of very barbaric with a fur cloak, and he's got this wonderful mistress lady who sort of has all these sort of brass rings and things. She looks very sort of splendid and barbaric, and he is essentially the dictator of the area. And he has this idea that if he can conquer what he calls the people of the hills, which are probably people living up in the Chilterns or somewhere, he can get hold of coal and oil supplies, and he can get these planes going again. He's got a collection of old-fashioned planes, biplanes mostly, from the late 30s, and he thinks if we can get those going, then he can expand his power and take over the whole of Britain, maybe. And there are one or two people opposed to this, scientists. Of course, H.G. Wells was a great supporter of science and reason. He thought that scientists were going to sort out all the mess that we've made of the world and provide a wonderful utopian future. And one of the scientists is featured at the beginning in 1914. He's survived, and he's still struggling away, but with the lack of resources and everything's been destroyed, he can't get drugs, etc. He's having a very hard time. And what's happened is there's this plague has broken out, or it might be a biological weapon called the Wandering Sickness. And the way that the Chief, played by Ralph Richardson, comes to power is basically he acts completely ruthlessly, and he orders anybody suffering from the Wandering Sickness to be shot on sight. And that's how he manages to get control over the sickness and stamp out the plague, and that's how he becomes the master of the whole region. Anyway, so what happens is that he tries to get the old planes going. There's a young scientist. Oops, sorry, slight break there. The Chief gets this young scientist to manage to get one or two planes going, and he flies off. No, anyway, let's get the order of this right. No, that's right. Before that, a plane appears out of the blue, literally, but it's a really extraordinary, futuristic, modern plane, and it's come from far away. It's come from Basra in what would be Iraq now, and it contains Raymond Massey. Raymond Massey has survived from 1940, but he's actually got together with a lot of scientists and aviators in Basra, of all places, and they are pushing forward technology of the future. They've created a kind of organisation called Wings Over the World, and they are massively technologically superior to the sort of robber chief sort of regime of Ralph Richardson. And he's taken prisoner, and Richardson tries to get him to get the old biplanes working. In the end, the young scientist escapes in a biplane. He gets the news to Wings Over the World, and they send a fleet of massive... It's an amazing moment in the film. These huge planes, the size of, the size of 707s, or even bigger than that. Very extraordinary looking things with multiple wings and lots of propellers and things, and they come droning over, and the pathetic little biplanes go up and try to fight them. They all just got shot down, no problem at all. And then they drop this gas on the whole area, but it's not poison gas, it's sleeping gas. It just puts everybody to sleep. There's this wonderful moment. Ralph Richardson, the Chief, holds out longer than anybody else, and he's pathetically firing his revolver into the air, trying to fight to the very last, and he gets killed, in fact, in the end. Then Wings Over the World basically come and sort everything out. And then from then on, the film becomes less sort of realistic. It becomes more of a kind of a vision, a montage, if you like, of the future, and it sweeps through decades into the 21st century. This is one of the most amazing moments of the film, because the whole point is that this film is visually one of the most striking films of the 1930s, especially when it gets to the future, because all these amazing futuristic cities are built and machinery, and you see all these incredible machines moving upwards and forwards, and science, and they use back projections in a very interesting way. A guy called Moholy Nagy, who was a very famous designer, Hungarian designer, designed back projections and futuristic sets, although unfortunately apparently quite a lot of them, those sequences were not used in the final film, which is an interesting point. The version that most people know, and I know, is actually a shorter version. There is a longer version around which I'd like to see, because quite a lot more footage was shot than was used in the cut that most people know. Anyway, so they surge into the future, and it ends up at every town in about 2040, and by then the cities are underground and they're lit by artificial light, and above you see all the beautiful green countryside of England, all beautiful and pristine and unspoilt. The cities are underground, and they're all built of glass and steel and plastic, and everything is incredible, and they have gigantic 100-foot high video screens and all kinds of amazing things. But all is not well, because they're planning to launch a spacecraft, and there's this artist, sculptor character played by Cedric Hardwicke, who's a bit of a Luddite. He thinks it's all going too far, all this progress, and he thinks people are losing track of reality, and he leads a rebellion, a kind of Luddite rebellion, and they want to destroy the space gun. This is the interesting thing, that in H.G. Wells' concept, he doesn't think in terms of rockets, or he thinks of that what's going to be done is a kind of massive projectile fired from a gigantic gun, which will then put people into orbit and send them to the moon and to the stars. A young couple have volunteered to be the pilots, and what happens is there's this kind of very Cedric Hardwicke appears on all the massive video screens and foments revolt, and a huge mob rush towards the space gun, but it's actually fired prematurely, and they know that in fact they're not going to come back, the young couple who are the pilots, but they want to just go into the stars, and it's a kind of symbolic act of heroism, I suppose. And it ends with a wonderful, if maybe slightly corny scene, but there's a marvellous scene with Raymond Massey and the other character, another character whose name I forget, looking up into the stars and wondering what's going to happen to the young people who happen to be their son and daughter, in fact. And Raymond Massey basically says this classic bit of dialogue, which is along the lines of for man there's no rest and no ending, he must go on, conquest beyond conquest. This little planet in its winds and waves, and all the laws of mind and matter that restrain him, the planets about him, and at last to cross the immensity of the stars, and when he has conquered all the deeps of space and all the mysteries of time, still he will be beginning. And it's quite an inspiring ending, and the music all goes to a wonderful climax, it's basically, he says, it's a choice between all this, the stars, the universe, and nothingness. Which shall it be? Talking of the music, one of the reasons that I particularly like this film, and I've liked it for a long time, is it has music by a very notable composer, British composer of that period, in the 1930s. Well, actually, he was active from the 1920s to the 1970s, called Sir Arthur Bliss. He was still producing music when I was in my teens, in fact, and he's a composer I'm very interested in. But he did very memorable music for this film, and the music really does contribute. This is a kind of favourite theme of mine, because I'm a composer and I do music for film sometimes, and I think music in film is a neglected subject. It really is very, very important. And Bliss's music for this film is just absolutely tremendous. Right from the beginning, it creates this fantastic atmosphere, and it builds up the tension, then it goes into this great peroration at the end. The film music is quite well known to this day. It's quite often performed as a concert suite of music from Things to Come, which is still one of Bliss's best known pieces. He's not a very terribly well known composer nowadays, but his music is still performed, and he's a composer I think should be better known actually. And in fact I put a piece of his on my other channel about music, the New Lyricist channel, his ballet called Checkmate, which is very striking as well. Anyway, so that's the music. Now, it's a fantastic film. It's visually fantastic. The design is amazing. The music is amazing. It has to be said, some of the acting is a bit sort of stuffy. It's a common problem in British films in the 1930s that most of the actors were trained in the theatre, and they were used to theatrical acting, speaking in a very clear, precise, and what to modern ears is it sounds like a rather kind of affected, clipped accent, but that is the way that actors spoke in those days. It took them a while to adjust to a more realistic style of acting that you'd expect in cinema. And in fact, apparently the film has been criticised by some people for not very good characterisation and kind of stilted acting. But then it's pointed out that really what Wells was looking at was not really a story of individuals as such. He thought that the fate of humanity and the wide sweep of history was what was important, not the individual personalities. They were just sort of pawns, if you like. This touches on something which is interesting. I mean, it's a very inspiring film, but it has something about it which is typical of H.G. Wells, which in a way I don't particularly like. Wells had this attitude, which was actually called by the famous writer C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia books and so on, who was a well-known writer on Christianity. He called Wells's attitude scientism, in other words, a kind of religion of science. And he typically, Lewis talks about this thing, the ending of the film, this idea that somehow what's important is for mankind to just spread itself ever throughout the universe and keep conquering new territory and conquering nature and conquering this, that and the other. And Lewis thought, no, this is not really quite right, because it's a materialistic vision of culture. And this was the problem with H.G. Wells. He thought that if we could get everything sorted out in material terms, with science and technology and so on, that would sort everything else out and we'd live in a paradise. But of course we know that is not the case. We have the most amazing technology nowadays, but we're still living in a world where appalling things are happening all the time, and people are not necessarily any happier than they were when they didn't have all this amazing technology. So there's a slight falseness to H.G. Wells's vision, to me. I agree with C.S. Lewis to some extent, and it comes through in this film. But on the other hand, it is a very inspiring film. It's not surprising, by the way, as a footnote, that the very last book Wells wrote, which was in 1945, when the world was once again destroying itself, was called At the End of My Tether. And at the end of his life, H.G. Wells seems to have completely lost this optimistic vision of the future, and he decided that mankind had basically had it. It's sad that he didn't manage to live a little bit longer and see the end of the war, and that things might have become a bit better after that. Anyway, so there we are. Things to Come, fantastic film, British film from 1936. The first great British science fiction film, one of the great science fiction films of all time, and it's a bit awkward in places, it's a bit clunky in places, but that's fantastically well made up for by the wonderful sets, the often very striking direction, the fantastic music, and the fascinating storyline. I'll finish with a couple of short clips from Things to Come, the opening titles and Christmas in Every Town, followed by the absolutely wonderful performance by Ralph Richardson as the Chief when he's confronted with the power of wings over the world. And if you find this video interesting, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe to my channel. Thank you.
highway. Here they are. Listen, they're coming already. Stand by. Clumsy great things! Our boys will have them down in no time. They're too clumsy. Where the rest of our fellas? Go on! I'll back him!
Oh, boy, got him!
They're both coming down, cowards!
But they can't be deaf when we have hostages.
The hostages! I'm not done yet. Go on, Peter, bring them out here, out in the open, tie them up where they can be seen. Where's the other fella? He's the prize hostage. He's the best of the lot. They'll know him. Fetch him. Fetch him. Look. Is that gas? Anyway, you won't get out of this. You?
Don't you see we're beaten?
Shoot them! What are you all doing? Why don't you move?
I never did you any harm. I saved your father and I saved you. Couldn't you call up your man there to stop this?
I won't have it like this. What's happening? Everything's swimming. Shoot!